I managed to get Carnegie to give me a semester and a half worth of credits to work on my startup.
If you have the means, go after that moonshot thing that you're most lit up about. You kind of owe it to yourself to do it. Do the risky things first while you have the highest chances of succeeding at them. If you want to stand out and be somebody people recognize,
Welcome back to the podcast, episode 17. We have one of my favorite online writers by the name of Nat Eliason, author of Crypto Confidential, and just a really cool guy in general. So I'm very honored to have you on the podcast, man.
Thanks, Justin. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's crazy because when I was in ninth grade of high school, one of my very first essays I read online was actually by you. It was
Oh,
how to,
really?
yeah, how to write a blog that changes your life. And I remember just
Awesome.
being so inspired from that. And now, kind of having a conversation now in person, or at least through virtually, it's just an honor. So I want to start off with Nat Chat because, as a college
Yeah,
student myself, I'm curious to hear your backstory on how this all started and what kind of got you inspired to start Nat Chat.
it's a great question. It's a deep cut. God, I feel old saying this, but back when I was in college, I mean, so I started college in 2011, graduated in 2015, so it wasn't that long ago. But even 10 years ago, there were significantly fewer people graduating, going into entrepreneurship online. Like the creator economy didn't exist as a term. There were very few people making money blogging. There freelancing, online freelancing was not as big of a thing. I don't think like Upwork existed or a lot of these others. It was just a very different online world for work back then. And certainly parents were much less aware of those types of careers as options. And at the same time, it felt very apparent to me, even pretty early on in college, that going into investment banking or consulting or working at a big tech company just wasn't something I wanted to do. And so I was trying to figure out, okay, like what are the other options out there and how have other people done it? Because it kind of like what you said in the intro, what you alluded to is knowing that at least one other person has done something like what you want to do makes it feel a lot more possible. But it can be hard to find those stories unless somebody is doing podcasts and sharing those stories, or those people are writing about them online and things like that. And so the podcast was really more than anything focused on just trying to find other very recently graduated people who were doing something they were very excited about that was outside of the normal career path, and figuring out, and most importantly having it work for them, right? Because the other version of this, which I hate, is that you have a lot of people who are recent college graduates, like pursuing their passion, doing their thing, posting all these Instagram photos, but their parents are giving them 5 grand a month, right? Like,
Yeah.
and most of the time they don't admit that their parents are doing that, but like that's a very real part of
Mhm.
that like influencer world that you have to watch out for. And so I just wanted to expose more of those stories and like help other people in college who felt similarly lost but hopeful find somebody who resonated with them.
Yeah, and it has certainly been helping me a lot just listening
It's
back to
great.
some of the old stuff that you're doing. And I think on the topic of education, I know you're very, a big advocate for, self-education, all that. I've came across one of your tweets, which was saying, how more parents who have the means to offer their kids a form of patronage. Dad, can I have 100K to pursue my music career? Absolutely not. Okay, what about 400K to get drunk for 4 years, get a piece of paper, and then make PowerPoints until I want a KMS? So could you kind of elaborate on that? I'm curious to hear
Yeah.
more of your take on that.
Yeah. I mean, it, I started to think about that more when my own kids were born and looking at saving for their college, because
Mm.
when I was born in the early 90s and my parents were thinking about, preparing for my future, saving into a 529 plan was a no-brainer. There was no other clear route to a high-paying career and access to the, like, upper class, intellectual elite, whatever, in the US than college. Like college was it.
Mhm.
And it was starting to get unreasonably expensive when I went to college, but it's just gotten so much more ridiculous since then.
Yeah.
I when I went to Carnegie Mellon, it was 65K a year, which is a lot, right? I mean, that's a
Yeah.
stupid amount of money. And now it's like 80K or 90K, right? And if you forecast it out for what it will be for my children, it'll be 15 years when the first one goes to college. Supposedly it'll be like 750 grand all in for 4 years. It's like something in that range for a private expensive college like Carnegie, NYU, like any of those, especially if you don't have like in-state tuition things like that.
Mhm.
And so then the question becomes, if I want to set my kids up for success and I have, call it $500,000 to do it, what is the best way to use that money to set them up over 4 years? And it's pretty clearly not college. I mean,
Mhm.
if you want to study physics, if you want to do like groundbreaking research, if you're going to do physics or math, or really like bits and bytes level computer science, or go to medical school, then yes, college still makes sense. But anything outside of that, it's really just a colossal waste of money at this point and time, right? Because the amount that you can learn and can do in 4 years with $500,000 is so far beyond where you'll get at even the best universities. So what are you actually paying for? I mean, most of what you're paying for is your parents' peace of mind, right? Yeah, like most parents won't be able to sleep at night if their kid still today, if their kid isn't like going to college and getting a degree because they think like, oh, they're, not going to be able to get a job. They're going to be stuck with me, right? Like, or especially for immigrant parents, right? It's like, why
Yeah.
did we come here if not to give you like the best education possible? Um, but so it's like, okay, we're paying 500K to make like to help our parents sleep at night, paying 500K to like meet people, right? There's certainly a network benefit, but as the cost keeps going up, that, those benefits making sense gets, it decreases quite a
Right.
bit.
Right.
And there are all of these careers that are truly moonshot careers, right? Sports is obviously one of them. Music is one of them. Writing is one of them. Any kind of art, anything where there's an extreme power law, right? Like startups are kind of in this camp too. Just the floor is a little bit higher on a
Yeah.
startup because if you fail as a musician, like you don't want to be playing at dive bars, right? Like that's not a good career.
Mhm.
No offense to anybody who plays at dive bars, but that you're aiming. If you fail at a startup, like you're probably going to get a 250K a year job at Google, right? Like your downside's a lot more protected there. But so if you can afford to send your kid to college, then you can probably afford to give them less money and let them learn a ton, take on one of these moonshots, and figure out the social network stuff in other ways. I mean, really, the best thing I did during college actually was, and I think this is actually a good model for other people to copy, is during my junior year, I took a year off to try to work on a startup. We'd raised a
Mhm.
little bit of money from an incubator in Pittsburgh, and I basically took a year off of school, but I still lived on campus. So I got to hang out with everybody else at Carnegie without really taking any classes.
Mhm.
I still got to be in my fraternity. And, while I was doing that, I was thinking, this is kind of the best of both worlds. Like
Yeah.
I'm getting, I got to meet my future wife, right? But didn't have to take, a stupid lit class, something that I didn't want to take, right?
Yeah.
There's something in there that's a way better use of capital and time than the current education system. But people just have to be brave enough to try it.
Mm, yeah, I can very much resonate with what you said because I think last week I just like cold DM my way into like one of Andrew Yang's events up in
Yeah.
LA, and I was like, I'm living such a double life, doing pretty much kind of useless work on the side for classes, and then doing have this amazing life on the other hand. It's like you know, it's crazy to say how much more you can learn outside of the classroom versus
Yeah.
inside of the classroom.
Yeah, and if you're one of
Yeah.
those students who is like stuck in college, for lack of a better way to put it, right? You have successful, well-off parents who are like paying for you to go to this really good school, but you know that you're not really like learning anything there, and you're mostly doing it to like appease them and to get the piece of paper, then yeah, I mean, game the system. Like figure out how little
Yeah.
work you can do to like
Yeah.
still get the piece of paper, and do the actual learning outside of it. I mean, I managed to get Carnegie to give me a semester and a half worth of credits to work on my startup.
Wow.
And that's the only reason I ended up being able to graduate on time,
Hmm.
was because they were willing to do that. And that was when it really became transparent just how much of a joke the college degree was, because we had to pay for those units. Like
Right.
I was doing my startup. They said, we'll give you a semester and a half of units for doing your startup, but we still had to pay for
Wow.
those units.
Anyway, it really highlighted how kind of faked, or kayfabe is such a great term for this thing that's fake, where both sides know it's fake, but we all have to play this game. The degree was to some extent, where it is truly an exchange of money for this arbitrary piece of paper that a lot of times you end up never using for anything. I mean, nobody has ever asked in my life to look at my degree or my grades. And granted, that's because I did weird job stuff, but it's not an uncommon story either. And especially today, for a lot of the jobs you would want, you can qualify yourself on your own way faster than college can anyway. And so the whole thing does feel like a little bit of a passing fad in some realm of the career market.
Mm. Yeah, I think there's one quote that I really love that you tweeted out was, for anyone in college reading this, please just get B's and C's and figure out who you are and what kind of person you want to be instead of caring about imaginary letters that don't matter. Literally, no one cares
Yeah,
about your grades. Yeah.
the other one that I tweeted that I saw some people pick up, which I think is also really true, is like college would actually be way better spent trying to find who you want to marry than trying
Mm.
to learn stuff for a career, because you can keep working and saving money and investing into your 70s, right? And you probably will, but it's going to take you, so like from when you meet someone, it's probably like minimum 5 years of like dating, engaging, you know getting engaged, getting married, think about having kids. That's probably like a minimum 5 year timeline. And by like, call it 40 at the latest, you want to be done having kids. And so from the minute you get into school, you've got like 10 to 15 years at the longest to like figure that out. Meanwhile, you have 50 years to get your career to where it needs to be. And so
Mm.
figuring out who you want to marry and have kids with is like way more pressing of a problem than your career. And on top of that, the more money you make earlier, the harder it gets to have kids, because it becomes harder and harder to imagine giving up this like rich, comfortable lifestyle you've developed. And so really I'd say, yeah, like do the bare minimum on school and like find somebody to marry instead.
Yeah, I think that's such a great, perspective because, finding who we're going to marry is so one of the most important decisions of our entire lives. And then
Yeah,
we spend right now, worrying about homework and grades. It just really doesn't add up when you compare on, the bigger scheme of life itself. So that's
totally. I
a
mean,
good
yeah,
point.
you'll ideally you'll make a good choice and you'll be with that person for the next 60, 70 years of your life. But even the best job in the world, you're not going to stay at for 60 or 70 years, right? You're going to change jobs. You're probably going to change careers a few times too. So
Hmm.
it is by far the most consequential decision you can make. And it's the one you have significantly less time to make than some of those other ones.
Yeah. And now I want to pivot a little bit to, your writing and congrats on, your book launch and everything, a few months
Thank you.
ago. Yeah, I read through Crypto Confidential in just this amount of a few days because it was just such a enticing read, just following along, the whole storyline and all that.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
Yeah. And I think you wrote an essay kind of reflecting on the lessons that you've learned over, your process of writing a book. And you were saying how, short form writing, like writing tweets, articles is very different than writing a book. And you have a really good quote. It's like, if you want to write a book, write an effing book. Don't half-ass it. Either you're all in or all out. So could you kind of explain a little bit about your thought process over there?
Yeah, the one thing that I realized when I started working on it was that when you write for the internet, it's a very checklist style writing. It's a very
Mm.
completionist style writing. Most people who are reading tweets, reading blog articles, they want to get through it very quickly to get to the next one. There's kind of this like, you're getting your quick hits of dopamine. An article needs to be super concise and super punchy to get a point across. People are not typically, they're not opening Twitter to get lost in a tweet. They're opening it to get lost in Twitter, right? And similarly, even for most blog articles, people are reading them to get to a point, usually quite quickly, and like try to understand some of the reasoning that got them there. But they're not trying to like get lost in a blog article. But a book is something very different. People do want to get lost in books. They really want it to carry them along, to entertain them, to feel like they want to keep flipping the pages, to stay in that world, which requires a very different kind of writing than the internet, instant gratification writing. And, certain nonfiction books do cater to that style of reader, right? There's a lot of nonfiction books that are super outcome driven, super results oriented.
Right.
The end of the chapter has like the key takeaways, one, two, three, so that you can just like skip
Hmm.
to that. They've got like big text that you can like take a picture of for Instagram or whatever. It's kind of like kids books for adults, right? And like those
Hmm.
books do well too, and like a lot of people do prefer those books. Those books sell very well, but they're not, if you want to make something that people just like love the experience of reading, not that they feel like they got some good like takeaways out of, something they actually like enjoy being in the world of, it's a very different skill set. It's really
Hmm.
this whole new art you have to learn. And to some extent, the more time you spend in the online social media, like dopamine world, the worse you get at that kind of writing, right? They're kind of different muscles. It's very hard to
Hmm.
walk in both worlds. And so when I was working on Crypto Confidential, I did a lot less social media, I did a lot less blogging, I did a lot less of that style of writing because I could feel that it was having a negative impact on the book writing. And now that I'm very fully focused on fiction writing, it feels even stronger, where it's almost discordant, and there is this opportunity cost to it as well. Where if you spend, call it like 2 hours a week working on social media content over a year, that's like 100 hours of work that you spent on social media content. I write at about 1,000 words an hour. So in that time, I could have written like another draft of a book. And so the question then becomes like, what's going to be more valuable to me in 5 years? Doing these tweets and LinkedIn posts or getting another book per year out? And
Hmm.
on the longer timeline, it becomes quite obvious that the book is the better use of time. But in the short, in like the day to day, it doesn't feel that way because you're not like publishing something, you're not getting likes, you're not getting comments, you're not seeing your audience number go up. And so you kind of have to like take a step back and take this much more long-term view, because
Hmm.
if you care about getting your writing into the world, like books are it, unless you're, David Brooks, New York Times journalist or whatnot. If you want to go that route, great. Like I don't know anything about that route.
Hmm.
But anything besides that, it's books. Like that's what lasts. That's what has a real impact on people, not social media posts.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems like a lot of, short form writing today. It's like we always hear the gospel of like write clearly, write concisely, and minimize the word count and everything. And it feels like writing books, especially like writing a fiction book that you're doing right now with your sci-fi novel, it's a very different type of writing. It's like now you want to expand a bit more, maybe, and you want to add more context. So could you kind of explain how, different it is writing a fiction book compared to just writing, a regular blog post or
Yeah, I mean, just think about any fiction book, right? Like, if Harry Potter was a tweet, like it wouldn't be very entertaining, right? Like
right.
you don't read it to find out whether or not he beat Voldemort. Like he's going to beat him at the end, but you want to know how he got there and what happened along the way. Like
Hmm.
you want to get lost in that world and experience it along with him, and like be surprised and delighted, and have all of these emotions along the way. And so much of fiction writing is like, okay, how fun can we make this journey? Like how interesting can we make this journey? Like and how can I be surprised by the journey too, right? That's one of the
Mm.
real magic things with fiction especially is that your characters surprise you. You start writing and you think one thing is going to happen and then something else happens, right? Something else just
Mm.
like kind of appears in your mind and it's like not what you had planned, but then it suddenly makes sense and you're kind of discovering this world before the reader even does. And that's this whole joyful process of its own. And so then it becomes this challenge and this balance of like how much can I put into this world? How like big can I build this story? How much can happen while still giving that satisfying payoff in an appropriate amount of time, right? Like
Mm.
a an 800 page book has a much harder promise to fulfill because every book is inherently promising that there's going to be a payoff at the end, right? There's going to be some kind of climax that this is building to, but when there's
Right.
800 pages you're also implicitly promising that you're going to be entertained for 800 pages along the way, and that's a really hard thing to do. I mean, that's incredibly
Yeah.
challenging. It's easier to entertain somebody for 200 pages, and then it gets harder again as you get shorter because you only have so little space to work with, and so like short stories
Mm.
are their own challenge in this sense. But it stops becoming this question of like how concisely can I make this point, and starts becoming this question of like how immersed and excited and curious can I make the reader about this scene or this beat or this period in this fictional world, and that's again just like a whole different challenge than trying to argue a point or trying to make clickbait.
Mm. It's like instead of, making that quick dopamine hits from like a short form thing, it's like now you're like building a world essentially. It's like you're
Yeah,
building a world that the reader can come in and just immerse themselves and just be a part of the storyline. And that's a real challenge, as an author or honestly like any other artistic disciplines. Like how do you create a world that captivates people to come in and interact with the characters and everything inside it?
yeah, it's extremely challenging. It's
Yeah.
but very, very satisfying to try to learn how to do.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you're really adamant about, tracking your word count every day. And I see you
Yeah.
post on your updates on Twitter. It's like, wow, it's like you're really like grinding it off. And I want to hear more about, how the story of your writing Strava app Prolific started and why you believe so much in the power of tracking your word counts as an author.
Mm. Yeah. So I guess I started doing it. I started tracking word count when I started working on Crypto Confidential, just
Mm.
because, I mean, really one of the big challenges going from online writing to book writing was there weren't all of these little artifacts along the way where I could say, like, I finished this thing. When you're writing tweets, you get to put out a tweet every hour if you want to, and it's like, hey, I published something, right? I'm getting feedback. It's getting out into the market. If you're writing blog posts, you might be putting out a few of them a week, right? When I started, I published
Mhm.
an article Monday, Wednesday, Friday, like without fail for probably a year, right? It was just like boom, boom, boom. It's like that is the routine. And then you're getting to publish 3 things a week. That's awesome. You start working on a book, and if you're doing like grad pub, book deal, big launch, everything, you're looking at 2 years minimum from when you start to when that book comes out. So that is a long time to be working on something with no ability to like plant a flag and say, hey, I published this thing.
Mm.
And so I really needed like intermediate things along the way to make myself feel like I got something done. And so having just a daily word count and being able to see like I wrote this many words this day and my new total is this, and if I keep that up, then I should get to like around the length I think this will be by this date, and so I can feel my progress happening. And it was really motivating, and it really really helped. And the thing that I believe really strongly too is that books are very strange as an art form in that you get so few reps. If you think about, like, say you're a musician and you're making songs, right? Like you could maybe make a new song in a few days, right? And like obviously you're gonna have to make changes and everything, or like maybe a few weeks, you spend like a month or two writing one, but you're rarely gonna spend like 2 years on one song, right?
Yeah.
If you're writing articles, same thing. If you're obviously like building a startup is another example where you get very few shots on goal, you get very few reps in. But there's all the little things along the way, like launching products or like doing an email blast, like doing a marketing campaign. Like all of those, you get tons and tons of reps for. The pottery class where they broke the students into two groups and told one group try to make the best pot possible and told the other group try to make as many possible. And the ones that were told to make as many pots as possible ended up making better pots than the ones who were told to try to make the best pot. And it's just because they got like a lot more reps in. And so focusing on writing books, it became pretty clear that I needed to get more reps in so that I could get better. But the only way to get more reps in is to, one, learn how to write faster, and then two, to figure out how to like condense the editing time. And that's like a whole other topic we can talk about too if you want. But if you want to get faster at writing, you got to track how fast you're writing right now. So I just started, what's my word count per day? How many hours am I spending writing? Where am I writing? What time of day am I writing? And then figuring out from that, like what a good routine is to get the most good words possible out of myself in a day. And so when I started, I was aiming for like 1,200 to 1,500 words a day. And then I
Mhm.
slowly got that up to 2,000 words a day. And then after I finished Crypto Confidential and I started on the first draft of the sci-fi novel, I was aiming for 2,500 words a day and bumped that up a little bit. And then a few months ago, I gave myself this challenge to try to write a whole draft of a novel in a month, which required me to do about 5,000 words a day on
Yeah.
weekdays. And I was able to do it. I was able to, for a shorter time period, it came out to about a little over 3 weeks. I was able to like push up to that 5K words a day. And that's like an insane amount of output. But if you can do that for sprints, you end up being able to draft like 2, 3, 4 books a year. And so now you go from getting one rep every 2 years to getting one rep every 3 months. And if you can accelerate your learning process that much, you can get much better, much faster. And I believe in that pretty strongly as just the best way to get better at almost anything.
Yeah, so I'm curious to hear how you kind of approach editing. It's like I think David Perel has a lot of frameworks on how he edits, like like the pop framework, like playful, observational, personal. I'm curious to hear if you have any frameworks that you kind of go by when editing your things, and do you kind of have a system where you kind of edit as quick as possible in the most effective way possible?
Yeah, the biggest thing with editing is making sure that you're never editing in a way that might get undone later. Because the biggest
Mhm.
area people lose time is editing the wrong things too early. So I kind of think of it like I don't have a good visual for this. Maybe it's like an inverse pyramid where
Yeah,
the first draft, you're just getting it out of your head, right? It's like you're just getting something down on paper so that you have a structure to work with and to start improving on. And then the second draft, you're nailing the story because as long as the story is in place, then you can start thinking about the smaller details. Because what you don't want to do is start editing your prose and making these beautiful sentences only to have all of those sentences get deleted because that scene doesn't make sense in the story anymore. And it's a
Mhm.
really easy place to lose a lot of time. And so before you even think about like word choice and description and tweaking your dialogue, like you make sure that you have all of the right scenes that you want there or all the right explanations that you want there and like all of that's solid. And then once you have that, then you can get into kind of like slightly higher level things like the action within a scene, the dialogue within a scene, the description within a scene, like the pieces that make that scene really feel alive. And then once you've like gotten those like, mid to small size pieces in, then you can really go back to the sentence level, and then you can say like, okay, one, which sentences do I want to make beautiful? Because you don't you kind of don't want every sentence to be beautiful. I mean, if you're trying to write Ulysses, then
Right.
yeah, sure, like go off.
Mhm.
But assuming you want a book that's like relatively quick to read, like most sentences need to be kind of utilitarian. They need to like do the job of conveying the dialogue, creating the world, giving the description without being so flowery that they slow the reader down. But you do have those ones that you really know are like, the ones people are going to highlight, right? And
Mhm.
you want to take the time to like tweak those and make them really like beautiful and exceptional and everything. But that comes like last, right? That's like the absolute last step of editing. And part of the reason too is like if you don't get to that step, you could still have a really good book. Like even if you
Right.
never get to the last three steps, if you only edit the story and you never edit the contents of the scene or the description or the beauty of the sentences, you could still have a really entertaining and a really good book.
Mm.
But if you spend all of this time like editing your sentences to make them very like flowery and beautiful and you never get the story right, like nobody's going to get through that book because there isn't
Right.
that like underlying architecture holding it all together and pulling them
Mhm.
through. And so you really got to think about like starting at the highest meta level and working your way down so that you're never, wasting time editing the wrong things. It's kind of like chiseling marble, right?
Mm. Yeah.
It's like you got to get the theme of Dave, and then you can get like the rough contours of his shoulders and his arms and everything, and then at the very very end you're defining his fingernails, right? But like a lot of writers try to like get the fingernails right before they even know what his head looks like. You just like can't do that.
Mhm. Yeah. And speaking on like, how the story is kind of the foundation for everything, it's like when I was reading Crypto Confidential, I had zero prior knowledge of, the crypto space. And after reading it,
Yeah,
it's like, oh my God, like now I know what like, blockchain L1, L2 is like, I know all these stuff
that's
because
awesome.
because of how he explained it. So I'm curious to hear like how can you kind of enter the mind of a reader who hasn't understood like a concept before and explain it in a way that is easy to comprehend for anyone who kind of reads your work.
I mean, it's so hard. And honestly,
Mm,
like if you want to write a book, don't start with something like Crypto Confidential because I had no idea what a ridiculous challenge I was taking on with that book
mm,
because it wasn't just writing a narrative, right? And like I'd never written a narrative book before. So like that was a massive challenge, right? How do you write
mhm,
a 80,000 word book that is a story that is entertaining that pulls people through? Like that is really really hard to do. That is like a very
yeah,
challenging art form. But then to add on top of that, trying to explain crypto concepts which
sure.
are like super confusing and it's a very opaque world and there's all this terminology you have to introduce. It's like that combination of things just leveled up the difficulty so much in a way I did
Mm,
not expect. And so I kind of had to try to figure out, like, okay, how do we explain, yeah, like L1 versus L2, or like what's the difference between Ethereum and Bitcoin without getting boring, without losing the reader,
mhm,
and in a way that, like you said, they don't feel like they're reading a textbook. They don't feel like they're
mm,
pushing themselves through educational material. And the best analogy that I tried to lean on was like, when you read Harry Potter, you never read a companion on like the spells of Hogwarts, right? It's like the
yeah.
spells are introduced in the narrative in a way where you like figure out what they do and what the words mean without anybody having a call out box that says like Wingardia Leviosa is the spell that like makes things levitate, right? Like
Mhm,
you pick it up from the story.
right.
And that was what I wanted to try to do with the crypto concepts. And it like I was able to do a decent job of that. And eventually I was like, I have to have these in between chapters because there's no other way to like get a lot of this stuff across. But even with those, you'll notice that what I did is almost every chapter ends on a cliffhanger and like a kind of
Right.
juicy
Right.
cliffhanger.
Yeah.
And then the explanations are very short. They're like 2 to 4 pages. And so my thinking was if the story is exciting enough and I've gotten you to a juicy enough cliffhanger, you'll make it through the explanation so that you can get the next part of the story. And if you want to skip the explanation and just go with the story, you can do that too. And you can always come back and read the explainer later. But then it's not interrupting the middle of the narrative and like slowing things down. The story is always going to be fast paced and fun. And then you can pick and choose the explainers that you want as you go. And I think that structure ended up working really, really well.
Yeah, I think I definitely love that a lot. It's like it's almost like you're gamifying the experience for the reader. It's like,
Yeah.
you hit the checkpoint for chapter one, you leave on a cliffhanger, and then you're like, oh, I want to read through the next 2 to 4 explainer pages to just to the next chapter. So I think you did a wonderful job as someone who's
Thanks.
really enjoyed your book. Yeah, and I kind of want to pivot to, looking back at your life. It's like you've done a lot of different things. Like you worked into crypto, Solidity. You've also made courses on like Rome research, SEO stuff. So how did you kind of come to terms that, writing is something that I want to do? Like how was that exploration process like for you?
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I started
Mhm.
doing it basically because it was the clearest way that I could get paid for something post college. I was
Mhm.
a philosophy major. I was interested in startup world. I was interested in marketing, and getting into content marketing was the clearest way in for me because I was already a decent writer. And so that felt like just my clearest path into the online entrepreneur world. And then just somewhere along the way, I ended up enjoying it more. I mean, and I've published well over 1,000 pieces in the last 10 years, between my newsletter and my blog articles and my book notes and like guest posts and all that stuff. And, I just somewhere along the way ended up liking it. And working on Crypto Confidential really clarified how much I enjoyed doing it in book form, and really made me want to try to figure out how to make like that my thing, make that my career. And so that's the path that I'm on now. And the one that I've been, I think, the highest conviction that it will be like the long term thing. And that's a nice change. It's exciting.
Yeah. And I think one thing you wrote in, I think one of your famous essays, which is 40 lessons in 30 years, you're talking about the whole concept of shadow careers. And I'm going to
Yeah.
quote Stephen Pressfield from this, which he said, sometimes when we're terrified of embracing our true calling, we'll pursue a shadow calling instead. The shadow career is a metaphor for our real career. Its shape is similar, its contours feel tantalizingly the same, but a shadow career entails no risk. If we fail at a shadow career, the consequences are meaningless to us. I'm curious to hear, like, did you have an experience pursuing shadow careers? And for those who are, how can we keep the most important thing the most important thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, that's
Yeah.
definitely how I feel about a lot of the entrepreneurship stuff, where I think a lot of that came from a combination of, like money maxing, income maxing, right? Which you definitely need to do depending on where you are in your career and your financial life. But also a little bit of like, it doesn't have the same like emotional risk or weight to it if this fails. And I think it's like a particularly big risk or concern for people who like do very well in school. If you like do well in high school, go to a good college, do well there, it's like you're used to succeeding at things, right? You're used to like being told you're smart and capable and like doing well. Um, and you kind of get like hooked on that expectation for your life. And so you end up like picking safe things where it feels like you have high odds of continuing to like get that feeling of success. And that can be kind of a dangerous thing because you'll probably end up doing things that you don't care about as much, but that are just like safer and can give you that,
Mhm.
sense of stability. And so it's kind of like the patronage thing that we were talking about earlier, right?
Right.
Where if you have the means and you have the opportunity, you have the savings or the time or whatever to like go after that moonshot thing that you're like most lit up about, that would also be like the scariest one to fail at. I mean, you kind of owe it to yourself to do it, right? It's like not fun to keep this in mind, but you literally don't get a second chance at this stuff, right? It's
Right.
like
Hmm.
like you just die. It's just like game over, right?
Yeah.
Like
Uh-huh.
there's no like, oh, okay, like we'll come back and I'll rerun my 20s. Is like, no, like you turn 30 and your 20s are gone, right? Like it's just
Yeah.
over forever. um and so you kind of owe it yourself to like, I think it'd be way better to like try some of this stuff and fail at it, and like then have to go do the safe thing, than to just do the safe thing because you're afraid of failing. Because like then at least you tried. You don't want
Mhm.
to, you don't want to get to like your 50s, 60s, 70s and be like, oh, I really wish that I had like gone for those things before. Especially if you could have gone after them and just chose not to. Right. That's almost like it's by far the worst reason not to do it. And I mean,
Yeah.
especially like when you're younger, before you like have kids and have a mortgage and have all of this stuff, it's like you have no idea like how safe and how easy your life is compared to
Mm.
the pressures that will be on you later. And so there's this myth that like you should, take the safe job out of college and like build up some savings and, do a typical career path. And it's like, no, 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 no. You can do that when you have kids and need to like pay for school and stuff. Like you're never going to be able to live as cheaply as you can now. So you should take full advantage of that and do the risky things first while you have the highest chance of succeeding at them.
I love this perspective. Um, it's like I guess for someone doing a more like unconventional, pursuing a more unconventional path, who wants to find other people doing the same thing or a similar set of things, it's like how would you approach like meeting high agency people who are thinking this kind of long term, perspective? Like I feel like it's kind of
Yeah.
hard to find it in like a traditional setting, and you kind of have to like find the hidden corners of like Twitter or you know do like a podcast like this to just to find people that are doing cool things.
Yeah, I mean, you're doing the right thing with the podcast,
Yeah.
right? That's a
Mm,
really good excuse to get to talk to people.
yeah.
Twitter was a really good way to meet people. It's kind of like been TikTokified
Mm,
now, and so it's like it's really lost that little corners of the internet feel that it used to have. So I don't know if it's as good for that anymore.
hmm
Reaching out to other people with newsletters, but honestly, it's like a lot of the time the answer is like become interesting yourself and other interesting people will like naturally enter your
mm,
orbit, right? It's like if you try to like DM Taylor Swift to be friends with her, she's not going to respond. But if you
yeah.
release a really successful album, like okay, now you have a shot, right? Like if you want
hmm
to meet other internet writers, like start writing good stuff on the internet. If you want to like meet other podcasters, like do a really good podcast, right? It's like being interesting is by far the best way to meet interesting people. And I think sometimes people want to put the cart before the horse and like try to meet all the interesting people first. Um,
mm,
you can get away with that until you're like 25 because people will be like, oh, cool. Like, a lot of people will remember what it was like to be in college and to like be really excited to like get into this world and figure it out. And so they're
right.
going to be very excited to help you. And so you definitely get to like lean on that for a little bit. But then you can't be like cute and curious anymore. You got to like do shit.
Right. Yeah.
Take advantage of
I
it
love
now.
that. Yeah. And I also want to go deep into some of your essays. I think those are a lot of great things that you've written and some of my favorite essays that, I constantly look back on. And one of them is like on known costs and unknowable benefits. I love this essay, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And one quote I want to talk about is like, for example, there are wonderful benefits from regular, intense physical activity that I was blind to in my soft life. There were immediate soft-term benefits, but there were sustained long-term benefits too, like being much less prone to depressive episodes, being less irritable, and for lack of better way to describe it, just feeling better. So I'm curious to hear, I guess from your experience running the Austin Marathon like a few years back, how did that experience kind of change how you perceive fitness and life? And did it perhaps like prompt you to like explore, I guess, on a different perspective in everything?
Yeah, I mean, this is just the kind of a recurring lesson, and I think it's why it's useful to like assume that a lot of the things that people say will make your life better, but that seem unattractive, like probably will actually make your life better.
Mm,
There's just there are whole worlds of existence that you're completely blind to until you enter them, right? And like being healthy
mm,
is a big one. Like if you are eating really poorly and not exercising and spending all day inside and not sleeping well, then you're just going to like get used to feeling that way. And then you clean all that stuff up and you feel so much better, but you have no idea like how much better you can feel until you do the work to get there. Um, and it's the same thing with like relationships, right? There's all of the kind of hoopla around like keeping your options open, like dating around. I know you don't want to like settle down too early and whatnot, but there's like a reason that every culture in the world like celebrates marriage so much and like
mm,
encourages young people to get married and to start families. And it's like, because those things are like literally some of the best cheat codes for happiness there is. And like your life is so much better with a loving partner who you're building a life with than like going on hinge dates for years, right? Like it's
Right.
just you can't even compare the two. I mean, it's just so much better being in a committed relationship, but you can't know that until you kind of like take that leap and like do it and actually like try to be in one, right? And same thing with kids too. Like it's very easy from
Hmm.
the outside to see all the downsides of having kids. It's like, oh my God, they're expensive. Like I'm not going to sleep as well, right? Like there's going to be this strain in my relationship. There's like, oh, traveling is going to be harder. I can't go to restaurants as much anymore, blah, blah, blah. But like, you can't see all of the incredible like joy and like richness that comes to your life from having them until you have them. And so you kind of just have to like
Hmm.
have this general faith that like doing these scary things that people seem to enjoy being on the other side of like is worth it and just do them and not get tricked by the like short-term joy of staying in like the comfortable world that you are now. And it's just like a useful heuristic, right? Is that like
Yeah. Yeah.
if you know the costs but you don't understand the benefits, but people do seem to enjoy being on the other side, it's probably worth joining them, like even more than you could know.
Yeah, it's like from my experience, I'm a huge runner. It's like I run like 10Ks every day, and it's like on the outside, it seems like pretty crazy, right? It's like, how do you run so much? But it's like once you're in that world, the benefits you receive are just insane. It's like for the
Yeah.
person who's out running, it's like they can't really comprehend that until you actually try it. And that kind of ties into like your other essay, which is, proof that you can do hard things. And could you kind of explain, on, how it feels like modernity has gotten, a bit more soft in, going after these difficult pursuits. And can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it's just,
Yeah.
you create your own self image from the things that you do or don't do. And there is this very powerful belief and knowledge that like the past literally doesn't exist, right? It's like
Mm.
it's purely a figment of your imagination and like not an entirely accurate illustration either, right? I mean, like our memory is faulty, and again, like you can never return to it. It's just an illusion, right? And so your whole like self identity is based off of these like memories of these things that you did or didn't do, and that's how you create these stories about yourself about what you can and cannot do in the future. But you can be like changing that anytime, right? And the best way to change it is by like taking on these things that you don't think you can do. And you often find in doing them that like they're easier than you thought, like more possible than you thought, or you get further along in them than you expected. And you can quite rapidly change your self-image from, somebody who's like meeker or less in control of their life to somebody who's like extremely capable, extremely in control, just by getting like some of those reps in. And
Mm.
the example, one of the examples I used in the piece was like, why do you learn calculus like in high school? Because you never end up using calculus again.
Right.
But things like that are actually very useful signals for just whether you're capable of like doing challenging things in general. And
Hmm.
not just for your own benefit, but for everybody else's, right? Like there's a reason that the hedge funds and stuff hire Olympic athletes. It's like they might not know much math, they probably don't know
Right.
any finance, but if you can push yourself to train to become an Olympic athlete, you can do anything, right?
Yeah.
Like you can figure out how to like work in Excel. That's not the hard part. The hard part is like being competent enough to like push yourself in that way. And so it is just like a useful, again, like a thing to keep in mind is that when you have the choice between like creating, an image of yourself as like a more competent person who can do harder things or creating an image of yourself who's like weaker and reactive to life, like you kind of always want to bias towards the more positive one.
Yeah, I love that. And I guess we can finish off with some questions. And going back on what you've said previously, it's like for someone who wants to kind of differentiate themselves and stand out in like business, life, and career, it's like, how would you kind of approach that? And I know you wrote an essay a long time ago. It's like on local maxima, I think, on how, you want to combine
Mm-hmm.
different skills together to create, kind of like a person who can do all these different things and only that person can do it. So do you have any other like ways you would approach this?
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that anymore. I used to be more in the
Mm.
like skill stacking camp, and now I think that's kind of a trap. I think it's something that people
Oh.
do because they don't want to do the hard work of getting really, really good at something. And I think, instead I would say like if you're, yeah, if you want to like stand out and be somebody people recognize, like, pick a thing and become the best at it. Like, because you can do that, and that person is truly irreplaceable. If you're like a bundle of and programming and writing or whatever, you're actually really replaceable. It's a very fragile person to be because
Mm.
you're going to hit the limits of your competence quite quickly, and you'll get replaced by the people who are actually really good at marketing, actually really good at programming, actually really good at writing. And so I think a way better strategy is to like use the incredible tools that you have at your disposal to just get disgustingly good at something, because you can do that now, and you can do it way faster than you ever could at any point in history. And if you're worried about like AI replacing jobs, the jobs that will be replaced the fastest are the generalists because they'll be the easiest to sub out for these like complex AI agents. But like
Mm.
the best writers are going to be the hardest to replace. The best salespeople.
Yeah, and I think I've heard, the buzzword of like, having being a T-shaped, generalist specialist. And for
Yeah.
people like that kind of going about, it's like, oh, what do I want to be the best at? It's like, how can someone find that and actually go all in? Because I imagine it
Mhm.
takes a lot of experimentation with finding what you can zone in all in on.
Yeah, I feel like you just have to try things, and then
Mhm.
eventually you'll find one where you can know, right? I think once the learning becomes self-reinforcing, where you want to get better at it, and getting better at it makes you want to get even better at it, then you'll be on the right track. It's like if you start getting better at it
Mhm.
as an end in itself and not as a means to something else, like that's usually a sign that you're on to whatever it is.
Awesome. Yeah, and finishing with some a few more questions. It's what is something that you didn't really pay attention to early on, but something that you had to learn the hard way, like later down the road? Was there like anything that stood out to you?
Um, I mean, one thing comes to mind is just like understanding the time commitment of trying new things, right? Like if you want to, thinking about like what if this succeeds, right? Because it's like very fun and exciting to like think about starting a new side hustle or a new project or like starting to pick up a new skill. But if it goes well, that might be a 2, 5, 7 year commitment. And so do you want to commit potentially 5 to 7, call it 10% of your working life to this thing that you're about to embark on? Because you kind of want to have that conversation with yourself from the get go so that you don't have just a bunch of like random projects you start and then abandon because you're not like fully
Mhm.
into them. And it helps to filter things quite a bit. Because sometimes like when things are plateauing or not going well in one area, there's a temptation to like try doing something in another area. So you get that like quick hit of early energy and early success again. But in reality, you'd probably be better spent like directing that energy towards getting off the plateau in the first thing and not jumping around all the time. I mean, that said, you have to do some jumping around to figure out like what you really like and what you really want to commit to. But I probably erred too much on the side of like constantly trying to start and do new things.
Love that. All right, so the last question I always ask for a podcast guests, it's like, what's something you would tell like your younger, like 18, 19, 20-year-old self who kind of has the same traits as you, who wants to do great things, who wants to maybe start that business or start that pursuits? Like, what would you kind of say to them?
Yeah, probably just something similar to what I just said of like,
Mm.
figure out what skill you really enjoy doing that is valuable to other people, and figure out how you can start getting better and better at it now. Because if you can like the earlier you can get that flywheel going, the further ahead you can get than everyone else, and the more like opportunities that are going to be open to you.
Mhm.
You don't want to get trapped in focusing on like non skills that have the illusion of value but are not actually valuable. Like getting good grades, right? Is sort of like a classic example. Like it's
Yeah.
not actually a skill that anyone will pay you money for, but it feels like an important thing to do, even though it's going to end up being like a largely wasted 4 years if you're spending a lot of energy on that.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, if you're getting really good at building apps, right? Or like financial modeling or something, anything like in that realm, that's actually extremely valuable, and really, open up the rest of your life for you. And so, yeah, it's more than, don't try to figure out how to like game the system. Don't try to figure out how to like, you know, get a bunch of money really quickly or get an opportunity really quickly or whatever. It's like just pick a skill and get insanely good at it. And then everything else becomes significantly easier.
Wow. Yeah, it's like the game of compounding, you start earlier than
Yeah,
everyone else. You keep on putting in the reps, get better every day, and it's like over time in a long enough time horizon, good things are bound to
exactly.
happen.
Yeah, your
Yeah.
odds of success just keep going up.
Awesome. Man, I appreciate having you on.
Totally.
Where can people like find your next, upcoming project launch or your next book?
Yeah, yeah. Newsletter is blog.nateliason.com. That's on Substack, so people can subscribe there. And then I'm most active on Twitter for social media. That's just at Nat Eliason. So either spot works.
Awesome.